Great, we're live on YouTube as well. We're just about to begin the session in 2 minutes. Thank you for being here and watching, those of you on Zoom and on YouTube. We have our speakers with us, so we'll start very soon. I'll request those of us who are here on Zoom to please keep ourselves on mute while the conversation is on, and we'll invite questions from the audience after the conversation as well. Thank you so much.
All right, I think it's 2 o'clock now and we can start our program. Very warm welcome everyone to Education South Asia seminar. This seminar series is a continuation of the conversations from our online conference that we had organized in July 2021 called Education in Crisis, Rethinking Education in Post-Pandemic South Asia. And we are taking those conversations forward through Education South Asia Network, which is a collaborative platform for discussions around various issues related to education and South Asia. So thank you very much everyone who have already joined Education South Asia Network. Do share this information about this network with your friends and colleagues who might be interested, and we hope to take this work forward in more collaborative ways. We are very pleased to have today in this seminar series Andrea Kolbel and Sujata Singh in our conversations, in our seminar series today, who will be discussing Andrea's book, very recently published book, In Search of Future, Youth Aspiration and Mobility in Nepal. And the book focuses on politics of aspiration building and significance of spatial mobility for people's life chances. Congratulations, Andrea, for your book, and thank you so much, both of you, Andrea and Sujata, for your time today, and I look forward to learning more about it. I now like to invite Mohini Gupta to introduce today's speakers, and we'll move on to the presentation after that. Mohini.
Thank you so much, Uma, and welcome to our speakers. I'll do a brief introduction and then hand over to you for the presentation. We're really looking forward to it. So as Uma said, Andrea Kolbel and Sujata Singh are here to talk to us about Andrea's new book, In Search of a Future, Youth Aspiration and Mobility in Nepal. Andrea is a research fellow at the Institute of Innovation and Technology in Berlin. As a social and economic scientist, she's specifically interested in the changing nature of higher education, spatial immobilities, social theory, and participative research methods. She holds a doctorate in human geography from the University of Oxford and an MBA from the Central European University in Budapest. With her research into young people's lives and social inequalities, she builds upon her professional experiences in the planning, implementation, and evaluation of education programs on behalf of universities, ministries of education and research, and the UN Refugee Agency in countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. Thank you so much, Andrea, for joining us today. Along with Andrea, we have Sujata Singh, who's a gender equality and social inclusion specialist in CARE, Nepal, gender equality and social inclusion specialist, with 7+ years of experience in the development sector. She's provided leadership and technical support to integrate gender and social inclusion in programs, formulate strategies, and monitor implementation of initiatives that foster gender equality, women's empowerment, social inclusion, and combat violence against women. Thank you so much, Sujata, for joining us. Andrea is joining us from Germany, and Sujata is joining us from Nepal. So we're really glad that we can bring all of you together for this session today. I'll hand over to you now. We're really looking forward to your presentation, and then we'll have audience Q&A at the end. So all of you who are here, please feel free to type in your questions in the chat, and we'll take them up one by one at the end of the presentation. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Omar. Thank you so much, Mohini, for the kind introduction. Let me start sharing my screen so we can have a look at the presentation together. And I'm really, really excited today to be able to talk about my book. The book is a study of young people's capacity to identify and realize promising educational and occupational pathways. It is about the social influences and also the structuring forces that shape young people's future orientations and the uneven and, well, also unexpected ways in which young people forge their futures. At the center of the book are the stories of 40 young women and men who in 2011 and 12 were all studying, working, and living in Nepal's capital city, Kathmandu. So the book has been 9 years in the making and eventually got published amidst the pandemic. I have to admit that back in 2011, 2012, I would not have dared to imagine that the findings presented in the book may help us to better understand which aspirations, but also which anxieties young people have with regard to their own futures. Now that so many people in different parts of the world had to put their hopes for an academic, well, let alone an international education on hold. The other reason why I've been looking most forward to today's discussion is because I can do it together with Sujata. Sujata and I conducted most of the interviews together and we became really good friends. And I certainly learned so much from her while we were crisscrossing through Kathmandu in order to meet with our research participants. Apart from being the best ever research assistant, Sujata was also studying on Patin campus for her master's degree in social science. So she is really in the best position to tell you a bit more about the university campus and her former classmates. And with this, I would like to give the word to Sujata.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you so much for such a kind words and warm acknowledgement. I would like to thank you again for giving me the opportunity to work with you in your amazing research project and also for opportunity to talk about our experiences in this important seminar. Thank you so much. So I would quickly like to talk about about the Patin Multiple Campus. Patin Multiple Campus is a constituent campus of Tribhuvan University, Nepal's oldest and only state-funded university. Any prospective student who passed the qualifying lower degree and are able to pay the registration fee of around 150. This was the price back then in 2011 and 12 when we were doing this research, but I believe it has increased with the time now. Were admitted for the course that are taught at the Department of Social Science, Humanities, and Management throughout the academic year. Many students would decide to enroll at the Pathan Multiple Campus precisely because they could, combine their university studies with other competing priorities, such as it could be a full-time job or a family commitments. So looking at the socio-demography of the student of Pathan Multiple Campus, historical disparity with regard to students' gender, caste, and ethnic identities and geographical origins remain largely intact. When we studied back then, two-thirds of the students of Pathan Multiple Campus were men, and more than two-thirds of the students, both women and men combined, belong to the so-called upper caste, namely Brahman and Kshetri, who only represent about one-third of Nepal's total population. Equally overrepresented were Newars, the ethnic and linguistic group that has long dominated the social and cultural life within the Kathmandu Valley. With regard to the nature and extent of the unequal representation of different social groups, Pathan campus was and is even now no different than any other public university campus in Nepal. Official enrollment figures hide a number of the trends which suggest that patterns of social inequality have started to change, or at least, let's say, have become more equivocal. In most of the social sciences courses, gender parity has been reached. In addition, about two-thirds of the students of Pathal campus were grew in a other part of the country. Around 60 of the 70 districts of Nepal were listed by them as places of their origin. Many of them belong to ethnic groups, or let's say marginalized and Dalits, and often were the first in their extended families to continue their higher education. So more importantly, perhaps social differences, be it in terms of people's gender, caste, or class background, these were little bit important for ways, in which students interact with one another while being a campus setting. So with this brief background about Pathan campus and its student, I would like to stop here and over to you, Andrea.
Thank you very much, Sujata, for the brief overview over students' backgrounds and also the description of the people with whom you went to university. What it shows is that our research contributes to a set of literature about the educated youth and related social expectations. And I would like to pause here to ask actually our seminar participants how they would describe this specific social group. So let me swap to the next slide, and there you can see a little online survey basically, and the question about sort of the first three words that come to your mind when you think about the educated young people. So either you could scan with your smartphones the QR code here on the slide, or you could also click on the link which is posted in the chat and type in the three words that really come to your mind. I leave the slide here for a short moment for those who want to scan the QR code, and then we can look together at the results as they are coming in. So let me change to the results. Here we are. There's already one person posting. More coming in. Great. Few more, perhaps, if you want to participate. I hope the link opens and you can join. Excellent. Thank you so much for taking part in this very quick sort of survey. And we can have a look at it again during the discussion round, because you can continue sort of posting and submitting your answers during the presentation. But what we already see is that it's linked a lot with sort of notions of future. So people are described as ambitious, also as decision makers, upward social mobility, aspirational, but also critical thinkers, and very dedicated and active. And I think these are all terms which really come to people's mind when we think about this specific social group, the educated youth. Now, if we go back to the presentation, I'll like to show you how sort of the Nepal's national youth policy describes the educated youth. This is a quote directly from the policy, where youth are described as an invaluable asset of the nation, and youth are the pioneers and change agents of political, economic, social, and cultural transformation. Youth remains to be the chief heritage of the nation due to courage, creativity, learning competence, and a high degree of self-confidence, which is also considered to be the major source of nation building. This actually brings us back to also this whole set of literature which now developed around the educated youth, because that truism, or that youth are the future, actually captures very well an assumption that underpins much of the research in this field of youth studies. Young people's lives are commonly perceived as critical sites through which others may gain an understanding of what the future holds. Since young people are seen to be still in the process of making their place in society and of exploring and experimenting with different identities and options, they are also thought to serve as a catalyst for social change. This rather hopeful conception of youth agency nevertheless directly links to public concerns about the apparent inability of young people to resolve the difficulties they confront in the present. Particularly in times of political and economic crisis, young people often struggle to establish themselves within their respective societies and are left with a sense of being trapped in between confirmed social statuses. In the book, I scrutinize some of the conceptual ideas that underlie prevalent visions of youth as agents of social change and as a source of hope for a better future. Now, one of those concepts is the idea of a capacity to aspire, as described by Arjun Appadurai, based on a study he conducted in the slums of Mumbai. Such a future-oriented approach to agency makes it possible to think through the ways in which we internalize certain limits of our own social positions. This can mean that people from less privileged backgrounds often do not even aim for certain achievements that their more privileged peers may take for granted, such as admission to university. Appadurai therefore argues that strengthening people's capacity to both set targets for the future as well as to navigate a way towards them can help people to improve their lives and can spur social transformation at a larger scale. In the conversations we had with young Nepalis in Kathmandu, it became very clear that a host of social and institutional actors, such as parents and peers, but also mass media and policymakers, try to influence young people in their attempts to map out promising educational and occupational pathways. In the book, there's therefore an entire chapter entitled Fashioning the Future. Sujata, you might recall some of the common answers we've got when we ask what people wanted to do after completing their studies.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. Yes, I remember the first time when we told one of our participants about our research into young people's life in Kathmandu and their aspiration for the future. You know, she did not see the need for any investigation or much explanation on this topic. In her opinion, the answer was easy enough, and straight away she said, I'm just going to quote the words she said. She said that these days you study, you complete your +2, that means grade 11 and 12, and you go abroad for your bachelor's degree, and there you also earn money. this has become a fashion for everybody. She further added that, all want to go to America, and with this Facebook now, we see friends who have gone driving a car in just 6 months, and we think, oh, then I should also go to abroad. So this is how one of our research participants were. Similarly, there was another interesting conversation once when we got to the entrance gate of the UN office building in Lalitpur, and there was a Sabita, one of our research participants, and she slowed down and she sighed and she said that, don't you want to come here one day and say, this is my office? So, with this statement, Sabita was articulating a hope shared by many of her peers, especially those who are enrolled in graduate programs in social science and humanities. Other participant, was Bisal, and he also had told me before that he wanted to set up his own NGO to develop educational program for a community radio station in rural areas of Nepal. Similarly, there was another research participant who dearly hoped to find a job in the human resource department of an international NGO. So overall, half of the students I interviewed explicitly stated that they aspire to engage in social work or some kind of a development project. The non-government sector, they argued that offers a dynamic work environment in which educated young people like themselves could make use of their qualification and youthful vigor. In almost a decade period of now, I'm still in close with some of our participants, and I know 3 of our research participants who have moved to abroad. One is living with her husband in Australia, and 2 main research participants, they were studying at university in Norway and Australia. I'm not aware if others have continued their formal education beyond their study at master's degree in Patan campus. But also I know 6 of our participants who also got a job with an international organization that are based in Kathmandu. So the large majority is still living in and working in Kathmandu and have started their own families too, which is a very happy family, It is a joy for us, to know that most of our research participants have made their futures, maybe not in exactly the way they aspire to, but still in a way that appears to make them happy. So this is how some of the experiences that we have collected and wanted to share with you. So with this, I think I want to stop here and turn over to you, Kendria and Andrea.
Thank you very much. Yeah, exactly. It's what Sujata just described is this discrepancy that exists between young people's future orientations and their aspirations and the pathways that are actually available to them to realize these aspirations. But in the book, I argue that it would be false to conclude that these young people lacked the capacity to aspire. What I take from Apardurai's theoretical work is that an exploration of young people's future horizons can reveal much about why young people try to seize on particular opportunities in the present. So first and foremost, a future-oriented approach to young people's agency calls attention to collective future visions, which inform the choices individuals make. And here on the picture that you're seeing, it's one of the very visible statements that you see everywhere when you travel on the streets of Kathmandu, this appeal to study abroad because of numerous international education agencies and consultancies. But we shouldn't forget that there's a whole range of possible counter forces which may delimit young people's aspirations or may severely complicate the realization of their aspirations. Consequently, I hold that young people's chances of realizing socially installed future ideals are not solely a matter of their capacity to aspire, but also need to be understood within the context of wider social, economic, and political circumstances. In the book, I therefore look more closely at both the content of young people's aspirations and the extent to which their aspirations correspond to their social and economic opportunities. Moreover, I found that an uncritical emphasis on young people's capacity to plan for alternative futures and to identify ways to move towards them runs the risk of reproducing prevalent notions of youth as change agents. I therefore wanted to find out to what extent young people identify with dominant discourses on the role of youth in future society. And here I have another quote from a group conversation I had with students on Parton campus. And one of the research participants actually said in that context, the politicians call for more youth participation. They say that young people are supposed to be more involved in decision-making processes. But it's the same old fairy tale, no? The same has been said 20 years ago. And still today, youth are said to be the country's change agents. But I don't know anybody who calls himself a change agent. I certainly don't. Although such perceptions and related spatial practices deviate from pervasive and often normative discourses about young people's potential futures, I argue that it would be inaccurate to describe them as forms of resistance. It was not the intention of these young people to defy social norms and to challenge dominant future visions. Rather, these young people try to make sense of such widespread encouragements to achieve in the light of their own lived experiences. And they did so by appropriating dominant educational and occupational strategies. I deliberately use the term appropriation as it best describes the various ways in which the research participants use the resources available to them by virtue of their socio-spatial identities, and in so doing were capable of negotiating the multitude of competing social influences that shape their young lives. At the same time, students did not simply accept their positions within the socio-spatial hierarchy in the face of persisting inequalities and constraints. Quite the contrary. They were putting down roots in order to move on. That's how I call it in the book. And I discuss in detail how these young people were able to foster social relationships and gain the respect of other members in society. It was often small efforts of doing good that helped them to grow in confidence and self-respect. But precisely because such engagements are often far more modest than may be expected, they have so far been overlooked in the public debate. And I think I stop here so that we have sufficient time for discussion. And I would particularly be interested to hear to what extent do you think these public discourses about youth as a source of hope for a better future or similar encouragements serve still as an important point of reference for young people?
Thank you so much, Andrea and Sujata. That was really, really interesting. Are you able to hear me? Yes, okay. So shall we stop sharing screen now and we'll invite questions from the audiences here. Is there anyone who'd like to ask a question? Please feel free to raise your hand. I do see a question in the chat from Dil Prasad Shresh. Dil, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? Dil, are you here? If not, I can read out the question that's in the chat. It says, would it be ethical if we indicated the names of research participants?
I think I can take that question. Well, yeah, that's up to what you agreed with the research participants, I say. So in our case, we had an informed consent with them that we keep their identities confidential. And that's why the names we just use are actually pseudonyms. And also in the book, I use pseudonyms. The only thing that I do reveal is sort of my research site, Pattern Campus, but the names of the research participants are all pseudonyms.
Thank you for that, Andrea. We have another question by Shivani Mishra. Shivani, can I ask you to put on your audio and video and ask the question, please? Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
I'm sorry for the background noise. I'm joining in from a cafe, so I apologize for the background noise. But I just want to begin by thanking you guys for this very interesting study and presentation, because I wrote a thought piece on a similar topic in January, and although a lot of it was anecdotal when I wrote it, it was really good to see that someone has actually done the groundwork and research and, actually elaborately written on the topic. So I had one comment to make to your question, to the question that you posed at the end, and also a question based on sort of my own observations. And for context, I'm from Nepal. I was raised in Kathmandu, and then I just finished my master's from Oxford. So the sort of comment that I wanted to make on your question about how the youth maybe feels about the whole narrative on, they're the change makers for tomorrow or whatever. Anecdotally, I feel like because there are no spaces that are made available for them to take on actual positions of change making, especially in politics and governance. I mean, some of the biggest positions are still filled by people who are in their 70s, whether you look at the prime minister or people in most prominent positions of governance, you still see that the sort of like the fight and the struggle for power is still amidst a generation that is so much older than people who are, in their college, that there is no space to come and negotiate for, participation for a lot of young people. And because they feel so left out, I feel like a lot of people who do consider going abroad or who do consider getting an education to achieve upward social mobility, they're not even thinking that there is a space for them on the table when it comes to politics or mainstream politics and governance. So I really don't think that a lot of young people, including myself, for example, see themselves as the change makers of tomorrow, because it's impossible for 25, 26-year-olds or people in a similar age group to even think that they can have that position. And much like one of your research participants, I too, when I was younger, I used to pass by the UN office every single day. And I used to think, this is what I want to do. This should be my office. I even have pictures from when I was younger and, outside the UN. And I think that has more to do with the fact that it's one of the industries that people think pays well, that there are international salaries. It's comparable to, the reputation is better, as opposed to working in the corporate sector, which the average salaries, which are considered good, are still $300 or $400 a month at most, right? So I think there's also that element where if you think it's less so that people really want to change the society, which of course I think it's a part of it, but I also think the incentive there is that they think that their labor will be respected and there will be some international validation to their education and their experiences. So I just sort of wanted to maybe make that anecdotal observation to the question you posed. And in the thought piece that I wrote, I argued that while a lot of literature on migration and the argument in the mainstream literature right now is that, a lot of people go abroad because they imagine a better future for themselves. But I argue that there is a very strong sense of aspiration of upward social mobility through education. So education for a lot of young people in Nepal is not a means to an end, which is a good future, but an end itself, in that if they have an education visa, they can, for example, go to Norway or places that no one has heard of, growing up, like Croatia or wherever, even if it's just for a language course. Because historically, going abroad and getting an education in the first place, but going abroad especially was reserved to such a small section of the society that the middle or the lower middle class couldn't even imagine. But now you can, that space is sort of widened after, and people can go to these countries like Croatia or Norway to get their PhDs, for example, even in subjects that they might not be interested to study. But they feel like they can do that, and then they can take a picture in front of Times Square or like some bridge and post it on social media. And that whole aspiration of I too can have a piece of this cake is driving the education industry, where they're going to put the Sarak or wherever, for example, going to an international education consultancy and saying, I too want to go abroad. So, so do you think, I just wanted to ask, like, do you think that's a plausible argument to make, considering that you've actually done the research on that? And I was just writing based off science, like, seriously. Thank you.
Maybe I can start, and then Sujata, you might want to add from a more recent perspective, because but what I've observed sort of in 2011, 2012 is, yes, of course, the sort of education consultancies help a lot of young people to get the necessary information about what it takes to get admission to an international university, what are the visa requirements, but that in and of itself often doesn't necessarily allow them to actually get a visa and get admission. So we also talked to a few students at Barton campus who were actually attending sort of these preparation courses offered by the education consultancies. And I vividly remember one who said, well, this is the third course I'm taking to prepare also for the language exams in English, like the TOEFL test. And he still wasn't able to say more than a few words in English. So he was still lacking the language skills, but he had spent quite a substantial amount of money already on these preparation courses. And from what I see and what I also argue is that, yes, they help, but it often takes a bit more than just these education consultancies to actually successfully apply for a foreign degree. But of course, the also social status that is attached to an international degree not only reflects back on the individual, on the student going abroad, but on the entire family, usually. So families were very proud to be able to say that my son or my daughter is studying in Australia or the US or in Europe. But it also increased the pressure on those who actually would have liked to stay in Nepal. And it was more than a sort of a second best solution for them to decide to go to university in Nepal in comparison to apply for international university abroad. So I think it's a very valid argument to make that, of course, it's no longer only the elite that is going abroad for educational purposes. But I think what we also need to think about is that those who decide to study in Kathmandu also do that deliberately, and not only because they didn't manage not to get a student visa. Sujata, maybe you can share some perspectives on that as well. Maybe there's a problem with the internet. Yeah,
I think Sujata's internet may have gone off. That's all right. Maybe we can come back to that when Sujata's back. Thank you so much, Andrea. And thank you, Shivani, for sharing your work and asking us the question as well. I think Sujata is back now. Sujata, are you here? Okay, no problem. We can move on and listen to another question and then maybe come back to that. Thank you so much. So Thomas Krippner has a question. Thomas, would you like to unmute yourself and ask directly?
Yeah, of course. I hope this is working. Mohini, can you hear me?
Yes, it is. You can switch on your video as well if you like. Yes,
okay.
Perfect. Perfect.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation of your amazing, intriguing research and also of your book insights. And thank you, Sujata, if you can hear me, for your contribution. And I'm particularly interested to talk a little bit about decision-making processes within students. And I think that although you are particularly looking at a migrational aspect here, I think cross-culturally students are perceived to be in this intermediary status. And you mentioned this in-betweenness as something, you had this critical reference saying that young people being perceived as catalysts of social change should be, seen more differentiated. And I would be interested whether you say this in-between status, the idea of the student as somebody who is both an apprentice and a professional and a beginner and how do you say, a future to be expert and an adolescent and an adult. So there's so many in-between status that we can find. And I wanted to ask into the group whether you think that looking at this in-betweenness as a particular social status of students across cultures is actually a decision-making enabler, and whether it facilitates to design your future in a way that maybe others can't, that people who, who go into different educational or professional pathways or who have a job, or whether you would say actually this in-betweenness is a hindrance because it in terms of what you shared about aspirational navigational capacity and to be able to imagine what you could do in the future. So this is my question, and thank you so much for sharing your research.
Oh, that's a tough question. Thank you. Whether it's a hindrance or an enabler, that's a very good question. I initially also considered sort of having a research project with sort of bachelor students, for example, and I did a short pilot study before I then decided to base my research on Pattern Campus. The reason why I eventually mainly spoke with students who were already in their master's degree was because bachelor students often only answered, well, when I completed my bachelor's, I'll continue with my master's. So they didn't quite feel the same pressure to sort of make a decision about what they wanted to do next. It was quite clear for them what they wanted to do next. With the students who were already studying for their master's degree, it was more complex for them. Actually, I think almost everybody was working alongside their university studies. So for me, it was also surprising initially that the lectures and the classes at Pattern Campus were actually organized around official office hours. So the students had to start at their classes very early in the morning, and classes finished usually by, 9, 10 a.m. So people were able to rush off to get to their office and do their, job there. So there was not such a clear-cut sort of or linear development between first I study at university, and once I've got my degree, then I enter the job market. Often people had to combine these, competing commitments at the same time. And I think that made it very obvious to them that they were in a position where sort of whichever decision they were taking were sort of setting the pathways for the future. And it was sort of in the book I refer to Jennifer Johnson Hanks' concept of vital conjunctures, who also describes that it's very rare that there's this sort of linear development, and that people are at different sort of vital conjunctures in their life at different stages, not all at the same time, and that it's in those situations where sort of suddenly the future appears to be under debate. And I think most of our research participants felt exactly that they were at a sort of conjuncture in their life where they had to decide both in terms of their education, their job, but also their family commitments, where they wanted to go next. And in a way, this in-between status, I think, yes, allows them to sort of make this decision, but at the same time, there's also so many social expectations linked to that, that of course these decisions are structured quite strongly by parents, by peers, by sort of the media as well. And people are not as free as we would like them to think in terms of which decisions they make. Sujata, if your internet is back, maybe I'll hand over to you, and maybe you can also add from your perspective a few words. No, I'm afraid it's not working at this stage.
Yeah, I think the internet is on and off, unfortunately. Well, maybe we can again move on, unless there's something you want to add, Andrea, to just wrap up. But otherwise, we can move on to the other questions. And hopefully, once Sujata is back, we can get her in to say some words.
No, I think, yeah, I think the concept of vital conjunctures might help us to think through this in-between status as a much more complex situation than what it is often described in literature. Maybe that just helps, but yeah, otherwise we can move on to the next question.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. We can see quite a few questions in the chat box now, so I'll try to group. And there are some questions which are actually really talking mainly about if there is any kind of link between the background and positionality of the students and their aspirations. I'll just try to group these questions together and ask them in the interest of time. For example, Shak Bahadur Buratuki talks about if you could shed light on the background of the respondents, their socioeconomic status, because it might have bearing on the findings and conclusions. And similarly, Lakshmi Prasad Oja's question about if the aspirations differ based on their gender and the gendered positionality. And similarly, Nenika has a question regarding if the aspiration would change with age of the participant. And Nimananda Rijal has asked about the fact that they go to Patan multiple campus, who are students who are clearly, who could know about their future, and they're taking part in the decision-making process accordingly. So basically, quite a few questions regarding the link between the background of students, their age, gender, social position, socioeconomic status, and their positionality of the students, and whether that might have a link with the aspirations that you are talking about today.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it does have an influence. I think Appaduraj says that aspirations always sort of emerge in the social fig. That's how he calls it, and it's true. It's very hard to actually pinpoint which influence sort of most strongly shapes a certain aspiration young people have, but there's a multitude of influences that come in, and part of it is also people's socio-spatial background and identities. But surprisingly, like if I pick out the idea that like a majority of young people with whom we talked wanted to go abroad at some point on a student visa, that didn't differ so much between sort of young men and young women, for example, we talk to when we think about gender identities. But over the course of those, 9 months that I was sort of meeting students on an almost daily basis, I found that there was a difference in the way in which people were able to move towards realizing their aspiration. So in the book, I recall the example of 2 participants, one a young woman who also really wanted to study abroad. And we often meant to actually go to sort of an information session about where to apply and how to get a student visa together. But every time she had to, cancel our appointment because she was too much tied up in her domestic duties. And she was the oldest from her siblings and had to take care of sort of the household courses as well. So in addition to her university studies and those household duties, she wasn't able to really make time to get the necessary information about what it takes to actually apply for a student visa or also take part in the language courses. On the other hand, there was a young man who came from a sort of a similar starting point when we first met. And he also had barely any information at that stage, apart from knowing that he really aspired to go abroad to, later on it turned out to Australia. But he had then his uncle who actually loaned him money for sort of the financial proof you need to provide in order to get a student visa. And he also got additional money from his family to take part in these preparation courses offered by the education consultancies. So within those 9 months, he got much closer to sort of actually applying for a student visa and for admission at university than this other student who just couldn't make time for it. And I think gender differences and differences in gender role did play a big role in this context. In terms of students' background, it's actually very diverse. So I always found it hard to also, compare my study with the work that Mark Lichty did already in the 90s on sort of the middle class youth in Kathmandu. And in his book, he describes sort of the university campuses in the early and mid 90s as sites of the urban middle class, where the educated young people sort of got together regardless of their caste background or ethical group. But in Paden campus, I thought it was way more complex. I wasn't able to say that it's sort of just a site for sort of, the urban middle class. It was much more, diverse in a sense. There were students coming from also other parts of Nepal, which really struggled to even pay the comparatively low registration fee and who had to work quite hard in parallel to their studies in order to be able to go to university. And then there were also others who had actually already graduated from a quite expensive private college for their bachelor's degree, but then had decided to continue with their master's at Paden campus because it allowed them to combine their career with another university degree. So it was a quite large spectrum, let's say, of sort of Kathmandu's urban society that was represented through the students of Paden campus.
Thank you, Andrea, for that answer, and thank you all of you for the questions. We are getting close to the time to end, but we do want to get in as many questions as possible. So I'm going to invite Grace Wright, who's written a question on the chat. Grace, would you like to unmute yourself and ask, please?
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. I really look forward to reading your book and just hearing more about all of your research. And I believe you've already kind of touched upon some parts of my question, which is just how reflective students were of their connections to their families. And so I guess more specifically, I'm wondering if there were, what sort of emotions are maybe reflected in when students were thinking about their connections to home and sort of those competing obligations. So for example, in the example that you gave before about the student who had domestic household duties, so what sort of maybe emotions were reflective in students' accounts of having competing obligations maybe to their family and also their studies? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, I mean, generally, I would describe all of my research participants as young people who really strove to comply with sort of their family's expectations. I mean, they really wanted their parents and their siblings and their extended family to be proud of what they did, and were also especially young men were very sort of aware that they really wanted to get a well-paid job in order to be able to financially support also their families. But at the same time, they also were quite clear on how they differed, especially from the parental generation. They were very proud that they were able to continue to higher levels to university education. And they often also explained that sort of their parents either had not completed school education or had sort of only obtained sort of lower levels of schooling. And in this way, they also set themselves apart from sort of their parental generation, and some also from older siblings who hadn't been able to either complete university or to even continue to university. So this sort of status of being an educated person was very important for these young people. And it also came through in discussions where they said that parents don't really understand also some of the difficulties they were facing either at university or in their attempts to sort of get a good job with international organizations, because parents sometimes never had entered a university campus themselves, and so couldn't really understand what it meant to study at university. And that's also where they kind of critically engaged with some of these expectations their parents put on them. So it's this, but it was not in a way of resisting or being rebellious against sort of parental expectations.
Thank you, Andrea. Can I invite, we have a few more minutes. We have 2 questions here. So can I invite Zing and then May to ask their questions, but let's keep it as brief as possible. We do want to get both questions in if possible. So Zing, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. Just have a quick question about the subjects that the university students, your informants, they prefer. Are there any like certain subjects that are in particular favored, and any subjects that they believe, can bring them a more promising future? So that's just one quick question on the subjects.
Yes, I mean, for 2 reasons. In Nepali society, sort of the natural science, like physics, for example, are presumed to be more difficult and also often tend to be more expensive in terms of actually registration fee or admission fees or course fees. So they are often presumed to sort of be a higher status. Also on Parton campus, students who wanted to sign up for a course at the physics department had sort of higher admission requirements. At the same time, students who were studying sort of for social science, economics, and humanities were often better able to actually also start a career alongside their university studies and were often more successful as well in terms of then getting a job within the development sector or with sort of an NGO or a corporate organization. So it's hard to say which of the two were more promising in terms of what the future holds. It has to do a lot with sort of, again, certain social expectations and perceptions that young people try to comply with.
Perfect, thank you. And thank you, Singh, for the question. Last question, May, can I invite you to ask your question, please? And then we'll wrap up with that.
Yeah, I was wondering did you observe any students adjusting their aspiration based on what they are currently facing, what they have? Because it sounds like some of the aspiration you mentioned already seems like, or sounds like too high aspiration, or yeah, if you just see any adjustment, or if there are any adjustments, what's the difference between those who have adjusted their aspirations and who just continue to have relatively high aspirations?
Well, what I show in the book is that, yes, they all kind of adjusted their aspirations, and they were very much aware that sort of some of the dominant future visions or ideals that were attached to sort of their status as a university student, as an educated person, were sort of out of reach for them personally. But with this sort of adjusting their aspirations, I would say it's not a matter of actually sort of, well, giving up or letting go. That's what I mean by the word of appropriations. I mean, they really managed quite successfully in most cases to sort of just appropriate sort of their education and occupational pathways in order to then maybe not achieve exactly what they initially strove to or what they said they would like to do in the future, but still to be quite successful in terms of, well, completing university and also getting a good job, starting a family, and building a quite, well, prosperous future life. So I guess that's where I would say, yes, they were very much aware and also critical of some of these future ideals that are communicated in mass media with their peers, with their families, but not in the sense that they just gave up and had to let go of certain ambitions they had for their future life.
Thank you so much, Andrea and Sujata. We've actually, that brings us to the end of our program today, very much right on time. And thank you very much for that wonderful talk today. It was very nice to listen to both of you talk about the research journey together and sharing your work with us, and how you and it's really was really nice to really see you talk to each other and how you came about your research and your work. So thank you very much for that, and thank you very much to all our participants for your questions. It was a very, very interactive session. We had a lot more questions than we could take, and unfortunately we had to group them all together at some point to make sure that we take all of them during our talk today. So recording of this talk will be available in our YouTube channel, so please do share the link with friends and colleagues who might be interested to listen to it later, and information also, please do share the information about this network as well with your friends and colleagues, and we'll keep you posted on our future activities. So thank you once again, Andrea and Sujata, for joining us today, and congratulations once again for the book. Looking forward to reading it, and thank you very much, everyone. See you soon in the next seminar, and we'll be in touch with more information about that. And thanks very much. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.